All right.
All right, so I'm Lewis Cobble with North Carolina Department of Agriculture. I'm an apiary inspector, and I cover the 21 westernmost counties in North Carolina. And with me today, I'm very happy to have on the other end of the line, Dr. Jeff Harris. He's an extension apiculturist at Mississippi State University, and he also worked at the Baton Rouge Bee Lab for about 15 years. He was, I would say, at the ground zero there of developing or working on breeding bees for Varroa resistance. So as an extension apiculturist, I think his job title is probably the same as David Tarpey here in North Carolina, although those jobs can have different aspects depending on where, depending on the state. So I think Jeff's charge is kind of 75% extension and 25% research, something along those lines. And in North Carolina,
that's correct.
I think that's just about the opposite. David Tarpey is about 80% research, and the rest of it somewhere between extension and teaching. So things can vary from state to state. But Jeff, I regard you as a leading expert on Varroa mites and bee breeding, and especially when you put those two things together. And Varroa mites is certainly the thing that I'm most passionate about. So I'm thrilled to death to be talking to you today. And so thanks for stopping in.
Well, Lewis, good afternoon. Thanks for having me. You're right about the formulation. I'm 75% extension and 25% research. And you're also right, David's 80-20. And it's kind of funny, there's a joke amongst all of us that no matter what your formula is, they expect you to be 100% for every one of those components.
Right.
But yeah, you're right. It's a passion of mine too. Varroa mites, I mean, we had the misfortune, or maybe fortune, I guess, of being in beekeeping before, at least I did, before mites and then after mites. And seeing the devastation this pest makes every year on our bees is just disheartening. And the fact that it continues to be such a problem, now what are we getting close to? We're somewhere between 25 and 30 years ago when we first got the pest. So it's one of those things that's going to be an ongoing problem for all beekeepers, probably for a long, long time.
Yeah, so I started beekeeping about 15 years ago. So it was already on the scene when I got here, and it's really all that I have ever known. And it's interesting to talk to beekeepers who were doing it before, back in the good old days, and hear their stories of how easy it was. And I think, as far as I can tell, it gets more difficult from year to year. I think these viruses are getting worse. But as an apiary inspector in North Carolina, in my experience, so I deal mostly with backyard beekeepers. I have a few bigger beekeepers, but in my experience, in my travels, 90 to 95% of the problems that I encounter seem to be related to just three kind of big issues that I see. Number one, by far, is Varroa mite and the associated viruses, no doubt about that. And the other thing I see folks having trouble with is managing queen events, whether it's swarming or supersedure, trying to keep good, healthy queens in their colonies. And the third thing I see is feeding, sometimes feeding too much, sometimes not feeding enough. And I was just wondering how that jives with what you see in your world down there in Mississippi or in your past experiences.
Sure, that pretty much mirrors what I see. I would think our feeding issues, they're probably the rarest of the problems, but certainly, like you said, probably 95% of my problems that I run into on a daily basis. In fact, I had a client call this morning, send over a digital picture, and just looking at the picture, it was parasitic mite syndrome, larvae dying from viruses, adult bees on the comb, black and shiny with hairless black syndrome. I get that all the time. So Varroa remains number one. And then we often have the queen issues as well, complaints about queens superseding or newly purchased queens not giving more than 2 or 3 months life, or like you said, a failure to survive sort of what used to be considered normal queen losing events like swarming. A lot of times swarms don't seem to have the newly emerged queens survive and that kind of thing. And then obviously we have queen introduction issues. A lot of new beekeepers just rush the introduction of a new queen, and And so I think that those are the two biggest problems I see: Varroa number one, and then queen issues number two. And of
Yeah.
course, what I like to tell people is queen issues can also be related to Varroa. If queens are raised in environments where there's high viral backloads in the environment, then the queens can be compromised. Their health can be compromised by viruses as well. So the two can be related. So
Yeah,
you know,
certainly these I can kind of think of these viruses as a sexually communicable disease, like passing from drones to queens, and from queens to their offspring, and so I think the virus issue is just, it's very
yeah.
serious.
So the way they term the virus is you have vertical transmission, which is transmission from one generation to another. So when a queen lays an egg, she can actually transmit viruses to the eggs. And then, like you said, it's a venereal disease in the sense that sexual reproductive drones can pass it to queens during mating. And then, of course, workers feeding larvae can also transmit it horizontally among other workers of the same generation. So you're quite right. Those are all issues in a beehive.
Yeah. So with all that we know about the damage that the viruses can do, I think, you know, we don't have any treatments for the viruses, so it's really important that we keep our mites, you know, in check. So how important is a good Varroa monitoring and management plan?
I think it's crucial, especially we have this realm. You probably experienced this too in your experience as a regional consultant to beekeepers. Is we sort of have two audiences. We have the small scale hobbyists, and then we have the commercial beekeepers. And I find I can make more progress with the small scale hobbyists because the commercial guys have figured out how they're doing things to make the bottom line, and it's tough to move them from their patterns of behavior, even if it may not be the best thing for them. But for a hobbyist beekeeper, I think the number one thing you can learn to do is to manage your Varroa mites. If you can successfully manage Varroa mites, you can get rid of a lot of problems and increase the lifespan of your colonies, you know, from maybe a year and a half to 5 or 6 years before you have serious colony losses, that kind of thing. If you can just learn to manage this pest, and the key to managing it is sampling. That's the start. So
Right.
just learning to sample.
Absolutely. So you need good information to make good decisions, and the way that you get that information is through your monitoring program. And I've got, for my own bees, I monitor every colony 6 times a year. I've got the information that I need to make good decisions, and my bees generally look pretty good.
You're more thorough than I am. I applaud that. I think 6 is probably not bad. Some people are recommending in the teens, and I just think that's a little much. But you definitely have a good picture of what's going on, and you need that to. So we run into issues these days because obviously one of the traditional methods, or I shouldn't say traditional because we've only been dealing with Varroa about 30 years, but obviously one of the early and most frequently methods of control is the use of insecticides, chemicals. And so there's this big movement among small scale beekeepers, at least. There's sort of two worlds on the extremes. You've got people who want to use chemicals, and you got people who don't. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's just different philosophies on how to handle things. But both of them need to sample their colonies to know that whatever they're doing, whether it's some kind of physical trapping or some kind of management of keeping small colonies and allowing them to swarm, to know that whatever you're doing, whether you're using chemicals or those other methods, that you're actually controlling the mites. And the only way you're going to know is to sample. And so that has to be encouraged.
Absolutely. So the thing that I tell the beekeepers is, look, it doesn't matter to me if you treat or if you don't treat. That's a personal decision. What does matter to me is that you do the monitoring and you have that information, and it can help you understand why you're having trouble getting your bees through the winter. Like if I think there are a lot of people that aren't monitoring for whatever reason, and they're blaming their losses on some outside boogeyman. If they would get out there and do the monitoring, it would be clear what's going on. And so that's one of the reasons that I'm doing all the monitoring. It's like, look, I'm not just talking the talk, I'm walking the walk. and I want to
Oh
be an
yeah.
example, to let you
Oh
guys
yeah.
know that this is what you got to do to, if you're interested in bee health, this is the route that you need to take.
It, and what's neat is you probably have seen what I've seen in beekeeping is that every year we have, it's amazing, over the last decade or so, new people coming to this hobby and they don't know anything different. And so building that good habit into, as you learn this hobby, adding a frequent sampling regime and understanding what it means about mite biology, that's just part of the hobby now. Make it part of
Right.
that,
It
make it
has to
part of the
be.
fun. Yeah, I mean, there's no reason to be resistant to it. It's something you're going to have to deal with. And I can see grumpy old guys that for 50 years never had to worry about Varroa. Suddenly they've got this chore on that they didn't have to do before. But there's no excuse now. It just becomes part of keeping bees.
And whenever the conversation starts with, I've been keeping bees for 40 years,
Yeah,
I know that I've,
you
I've
know,
got a challenge right in front of me here.
yeah, you just nod your head and let
Right.
him talk.
Right. So yeah. So you were right, as I said earlier. You were right there at ground zero as we were trying to breed some bees that were a little more Varroa resistant. And so we've got several different versions of that, the Russian, the VSH, and others. How or is Varroa resistant stock a sufficient standalone solution to the Varroa problem? Can it be the only aspect of one's Varroa management plan?
Unfortunately, that's the goal, and we're not there commercially yet. What I should say is there's a caveat here in that, in my research experience, when John Harbaugh and I in particular, then later Bob Danka and Jose V and I were working on VSH bees, we actually had stock and retained at the lab that was standalone and treatment free. But it was the result of 15 years of selection. We paid a lot of attention. We had inbreeding issues developed in our breeding program. We had to fix those. So you always have this tension of having a good stock that's good for breeding characteristics, is not inbred, and then expresses the trait you want. And we actually had experimental stock that we could basically run treatment free. And it was just like keeping bees when I was a kid, when we didn't have mites. It really was like that. So we were naive in thinking that, oh man, we can transfer this and get it to beekeepers, and we can transfer the genes. But unfortunately, when we transfer it, when it goes into the industry, it's just difficult for um, basically a private individual, someone who's not getting millions of dollars a year from the US government to fund research, to sustain the effort needed to keep that stock available at the level you need it for standalone resistance. Not saying you can't benefit from it, but there's nothing that I know, I'm aware of. And the more time that goes by that it gets out of the hands of researchers. And think about it, John Harbaugh's retired, Tom Render's retired, Bob Dank is probably retiring this year, if he hasn't already, I can't remember. So these are all the people. I left the project. These are all the breeders that were involved with some of those big projects on breeding for Varroa resistance. Once those researchers are gone, it's harder for the commercial entities to have a source of good stock. And just over time, the resistance gets more and more dilute. And it's not saying there's not resistance out there, but there's nothing that I believe is standalone resistance right now, which is where we want to go. But
Right.
so,
I would agree. So I run into a lot of beekeepers that say, "Oh, I don't need to worry about Varroa mites. I've got some fancy pants stock here,
yeah,
and I'm just not going to worry about it." So
and
that's probably not going
yeah,
to be a reasonable solution. You need to
yeah, and they
do
get
that
upset.
monitoring.
Yeah, well, I get upset. Yeah, I'm like, okay, so you got this fancy pants queen. When's the last time you sampled? Oh, I don't need to sample. I said, well, how do you know it works?
Right.
You're believing this guy? You believe in that used car salesman? Actually, I shouldn't characterize it that way because that makes it sound like the breeder is being nefarious. It's not that. It's just that it's hard to control this stuff. And over
Right. It's
time, it
complicated.
gets, yeah. And so how do you know it really does control mites? And, if you don't sample, you don't know, and you can't, and then you're just relying on it. And I just think that's not a good thing.
Yeah. What's the right? Trust but verify, right?
Yes,
So
exactly.
if you find a breeder you like, sure, try some, do the monitoring. Are they getting you where you want to go? The other thing I would say is colonies or colonies that are good at keeping mite levels low, maybe they're hygienic or for whatever reason, that might be good for them. How do they do with an infestation from outside? So if your neighbor, even if you have great bees, what if your neighbor has colonies that are crashing? That's going to impact you, even if you have hygienic bees, I believe.
I was going to say some of the mechanism of resistance are kind of slow moving. They sort of act over time, over long periods of time. And if you get a blast of mites from dying colonies, well, they call it a mite bomb, they used to. You get blasted by, it may overwhelm the resistance mechanism. And even colonies that have some resistance can go down fairly quickly. So
that's kind of why so I don't have any special stock in my apiary. Just doing that monitoring. And last year, I do a treatment in August, September, and my treatment did a great job. I had almost no mites in my apiary in the middle of September. Came back and did another monitoring in the middle of October, and I had 3 colonies that had 0 mites in the middle of September. Now we're at
awesome.
5, 6, 7%.
Oh, wow.
So I'm pretty sure that was an infestation from outside. And
yeah,
it was important. That later season, you know, as I'm putting them to bed, I feel like that's an important monitoring period to catch, because if you have some bad influence from outside, you can identify and deal with those.
Well, let me say this before we get off the thing about stock. I will say I'm still hopeful that resistant stock and standalone resistant stock can be developed. And I want to say this because back in 2014, John Harbaugh and I and Bob Danka, we were at the Bee Lab in Baton Rouge for a meeting with some European bee breeders who they're sort of remnants of the Brother Adam breeding network in Europe. And they call it, this particular project is called Arista bee breeding. One of the researchers is based in Belgium. Anyway, their concept was, look, we've spent 30 to 40 years breeding a stock for Europe that we like. It's uniform. It's got all these qualities that we like. They overwinter well. They make a lot of honey. They don't sting a lot. The only thing we don't have is Varroa resistance. Can you tell us? They knew that they didn't want to bring our semen in because by crossing with our stock, they would have lost about half of the work they did for 30 years. Just by crossing, you lose half the genes. So they said, look, we don't want your genes. Tell us how to get there, how to do it with our own stock. Because we've worked out inbreeding issues. We've had this breeding program going for 30 years. We know how to control inbreeding. We know how to control who mates with who. Just give us the best technique for getting resistance to our resistance to mites in our bees.
Right, just share the methods.
Yeah, and that's what we did. And what was amazing to me is they went back to Europe and they recruited a bunch of beekeepers. And now where are we? I think we're in the 4th or 5th year of selection. And they made significant progress. And what's interesting to me is they've now got very highly Varroa resistant stock. And they never got the inbreeding problems that we got because they had already worked out the inbreeding issues with their stock in the previous history when they bred for all those other characters. And now they've maximized, they're getting their Varroa resistance way up there. And I think in a couple of years, they're going to have a stock that will be standalone and have everything they want, Varroa resistance plus those other characters. But it's because they're a breeding network of I think it's 300 or 400 breeders that work together in Europe, and they're being directed tightly. And so I'm hopeful, and they're showing they can do it in Europe. I wish we could do it here in this country, and I think we can. It's just, so I just want to remain optimistic, and that one day we may have, but right now we don't have resistant stock that can stand alone. So
that kind of leads to my next question. So you talked about this collection of 300 or so breeders that are working together, have a pretty tight protocol. Can I select and breed for Varroa resistance in my 10 to 100 colony apiary by playing the live and let die survivor game? How about if I purchase a couple of fancy pants breeders, can I just graft off of them and away we go? Or how does this work?
Oh, Lord. So here's what, this is where I make people mad, because I will actually say you're not going to make much significant progress with just a small starting population. And believe it or not, 200 or 300 colonies is considered small. We used to get fussed at geneticists and theoretical bee breeders would say to Harris, you don't have 400, 500 colonies in your breeding pool. I said, it's impossible for us to maintain that many colonies, even at the USDA honeybee lab. It's so difficult. So I'll say this, if you got 10 or 20 colonies in your backyard, I really feel like there's really no way you can breed for significant Varroa resistance without significant inbreeding, just because your breeding population is too small. So that's one issue. So that, in fact, that's a primary issue is anytime you're selectively breeding for anything, each generation you're narrowing down your breeding pool, and the smaller it gets, the more likely you are to actually cross relatives. And so that's one of the keys is, number one, to be a bee breeder, you've got to control who can mate with whom. And so you need to know which queens are being mated to which drone sources. And you either do that with instrumental insemination, or you have some kind of natural way of controlling drones and queens in an area. Like maybe you live on a barrier island in the middle of the ocean, like we did in Louisiana, or maybe you just flood an area with drone sources of the right. But you have to control matings as best you can. And then not only do you have to control the matings, you need to follow those individuals, measure the characteristics of interest, and make sure that in the next generation, you cross them with other individuals that are not very closely related to them. And if you only have 20 colonies, that becomes very difficult over time. And even with 100 colonies, it's difficult. So I would just say it's not impossible, but it's pretty futile to start with that kind of population. And even when you have, if you do have the right number of colonies, 400 or 500 colonies, then you spend all your time with maintenance and propagation, and it's just you need a staff. You need a staff of 20 people to do this right. And it's just hard for an individual to really selectively breed for Varroa resistance and make much progress. I don't want to deter it, though. I think it's a great idea.
Right. I certainly
and if
don't,
nothing, yeah, go ahead.
I certainly don't want to deter backyard queen rearing and selecting for those good traits. I only want you to have reasonable expectations and goals about it. Or if you're purchasing something from a backyard breeder.
Here's what I would say is you could probably, using some form of selection, you can definitely get rid of some terrible, vulnerable bees. And if nothing else, over time, if you're willing to put in the time, and that's the thing people don't understand, this kind of effort takes years. Even if you do make success, you're not talking about something that's going to happen in 3 years, 5 years. You're talking 10, 15. You might see a really good improved product. Depends on the trait. Now, I should be careful here because some traits are easier to select for others than others. You can make amazing progress, even though it's polygenic, with defense behavior. And we certainly have. There are California bee breeders that for decades have produced queens that are gentle, because the way they select is if they can't work them without a veil, they don't breed from them. Right. And so if you do that enough over time, you're going to have gentle stock. And there's some bee breeders that I've been into their yards, and it's like you can work them naked and not get stung. It's like, how do they do that? But it's because they were dedicated for a long, long period of time, selecting for bees that didn't react and sting the way a normal colony would, and they produce stock that's really gentle. Well, if you can make that kind of effort for a sustained period, you can do the same with Varroa. But the reason it's recommended to have a large colony size is for the genetics and inbreeding issues. And that's always a problem in breeding. So you've got the constraints of breeding and genetics of bees that requires a lot of bees to really make a good effort. And the other things about breeding, people don't realize you really need to know the identities of your queens. These breeders in Europe I mentioned, each queen has an ID that basically says who her mother was, right, who her father was when she was born, who she was crossed with. And they have this all in a computer database, and it can be brought up any time. She gets evaluated, and let's say she doesn't sting a lot, she makes a lot of honey, she has low mite counts, her colony does, and they say, wow, we want to breed her. And they look at her pedigree, they can pull it up on a computer, and they can look back 15 generations and see her entire pedigree. And then they do the same for the drone source, and they make sure they're not related. And that's what it takes to avoid inbreeding. And so not only do you just have the beekeeping issues, you got record keeping and consistency in measurements. You don't want to measure things one way one year and then change the way you measure 5 years later, because then you're comparing apples and oranges, So it takes a very disciplined routine to be a bee breeder. And I just think most people just don't have, the resources for doing it. But like you said, I think you can get rid of a lot of trash, though. I mean, certainly you can get rid of the worst things. If you got a colony that grows mites 10 times faster than the other colony, get it out of there. You don't want to breed from it. You don't want to make drones from it. So you can make progress that way. Get rid of the really bad stuff. But really pushing things to the highest level of Varroa resistance would take a really big effort, breeding effort to do. And frankly, the bee labs have stopped doing it themselves because the effort was just proved too hard and too long. If you look at, both the VSH and the Russian breeding projects have stopped inside of USDA, essentially. They're just too hard.
Yeah, a lot of hard work, man.
Yeah.
I was thinking if I were going to start from ground zero to try to breed a more Varroa resistant bee, you know what I would breed for? Like low brood production. Mites reproduce in broods, and these really broody colonies tend to have a lot of mites. So let's just start with something easy. Like let's raise some inferior queens. And
so there goes your honey production.
Yeah.
So that's the thing. I grew up in southern beekeeping, and we did everything we do down here advances and maximizes mites. So I came from a package bee industry. The guy I worked for when I was in high school into college, he was a package bee seller, and he raised a lot of queens. So, and then he made honey. Honey was his secondary product. So we probably sold, I don't know how many thousands of packages we sold. So we grew bees for huge size colonies, for huge sizes for package production. So we wanted fast spring buildup, and we wanted those colonies huge by the end of March. And so we could make packages. And of course, that promotes Varroa growth. And then the colonies we did use for honey production, we also maximized their size because we wanted as much honey as possible. So everything we did in beekeeping makes the Varroa mite problem worse. And so certainly, and that's where the natural beekeeping movement is. If you restrict colony growth, keep it down to a box, let's say a deep and a medium, keep your hive size down to that, let them swarm, you can actually fairly easily moderate the mite loads. Not saying you're going to go to zero, but you can knock them down quite a bit. But you also don't make any honey.
So, but that's okay with some people, right?
Sure.
It's a big tent. There's a lot of different ways to do this, but
exactly.
I see people, in February, they'll say they have 3 colonies, 2 of them are dead. They'll say, oh, these 2, I made 3 supers of honey off each of these. They looked great in September. This third one that's still alive, they were just kind of bumped along last year. It's like, sounds familiar. It's a familiar story. These colonies that are real broody, producing a lot of bees, are also producing a lot of mites. And,
it's interesting you mentioned that. So when this COVID containment broke out, they shut down our college campuses, and so I had some bees on the college campus, and of course it shut down here right when swarm seasons begin. So I had an apiary where I did no management. They basically said you can't go to campus, and so I think we were first allowed on the campus to check things out starting in June, which is way beyond our normal swarm season. So I had a lot of colonies that did not have supers on them, and they obviously had swarmed. And I had some colonies that had 4 or 5 boxes on them already, and they grew to be big colonies. Then I had some colonies that only had a deep or a medium, and they stayed like that all the way from March into June. And I looked at them recently, and it's interesting. Those smaller colonies all have lower mite populations, much lower than the ones that were big. So there you go. Natural beekeeping proven. But it's funny. It's so, I grew up in the South where big colonies meant more money. That's what it came down to. So I sometimes get caught in that mindset, but it's taken me a while to understand what you just said, is that this is a big tent. And there's so many people who just want to have bees in the yard as a pollinator or something they can interact with, and they really don't need 300 pounds of honey per colony. and so you have to understand, and I think that's nice that you can get that sweet spot that fits your needs and
Yeah.
how you manage, but you got to manage this pest.
Yeah. The other thing I'd say is, look, it's a hard nut to crack to kill mites in a big colony full of capped brood. So think about that when
Yep.
you're thinking about your Varroa management plan. A smaller colony, less capped brood it's a little easier to try to control the mites in those colonies. I mean, either way, it's complicated. There's not a simple one size fits all solution that's going to work for everybody. But I definitely want folks to remember that 2 deeps full of capped brood, that's a problem when you're trying to kill mites.
And that actually is probably every year. I just gave a seminar on this the other night, and this tends to be the biggest problem, is that we have a lot of plant sources down here that are available to the end of June and to early July. So we're still, some people in some areas of Mississippi are still making honey through the 4th of July. And it takes a while to fully ripen it. And so they're allowing their bee populations to grow incredibly high from March into July to get maximum honey. And then they usually are finding, and oftentimes they're finding that, hey, I'm at a mite threshold from sampling. Why my honey crop is still on there? What can I treat with? And the problems are here, obviously, when honey's on, the arsenal is limited anyway.
Yeah.
But then even within that arsenal, our summertime temperatures are too high to use certain formulations. You can't use thymol in the form of Apolite Var. You'll kill your colonies when the ambient temperature is 93, 95 degrees out. And similar, you wouldn't want to use formic acid in this kind of heat. So your arsenal gets even more and more limited. And so I often have beekeepers that have to decide, they're getting close to threshold.
Yeah.
Am I going to save this colony, or am I going to get a honey crop? And
Right.
That's what it comes down to. But you're right. You just have to be aware that having that much brood leads to, treatment issues. And there's no easy solution for treating for a large colonies for Varroa mites in a hot summer. It's
Right.
the toughest time of year to deal with.
Right. And
So,
maybe we'll kind of wrap it up. I just want to say it's hot here in North Carolina now. I can't imagine what it's like in Mississippi with the heat and humidity. That's got to be a challenge. And I will say that we're almost to early August now. And for me, it's the most miserable time to be a beekeeper, but it's also the most critical time to get out there and do this work to prepare for winter. We talk about preparing for winter as if that's something that we do in October, but it's now is the time to get out there, do the monitoring, and prepare these colonies. Make sure you got a healthy box of bees below and a box of food above. And that's how I think that's the most important part about getting through the winter. Make sure you got a box full of bees below and a box of honey above. It sounds simple. I wish it were as easy to do as it is to say, but it really is important to get out there and do that work this time of year. It's just critical to get that work.
I agree. This is the most critical time because, like you said, you're growing your winter bees. You're starting probably here. We're starting to make our winter bees at the end of August. But if your mite loads are getting near or out of control, you've got to get them controlled before you start making winter bees, because the viral diseases compromise the health of the winter bees. But the other issue is if you have chemicals on when you're raising winter bees, those chemicals can also compromise the health of your winter bees. So you've got to take care of the mite issues in front of growing your winter bees. So this is critical. If you haven't sampled at all, you need to be sampling now, or early July is what I say. I try to get my beekeepers to sample by the end of June, or if they're taking their honey off in July, as soon as the honey's off, you got to sample, because you gotta know what's going on, because you don't have much time now before you start making those winter bees.
Yeah, well,
and your survival. Yeah,
you need healthy nurse bees to raise the nurse bees that are going to raise your winter bees. So you got to back up a couple of generations and make sure that they're in good shape before you start to raise your winter bees.
Yeah, that's right.
And
it's not easy. The most frustrating phone call I get is from experienced beekeepers who tell me they're losing colonies in the fall. And you ask them, did they monitor? No, but I put a treatment on in September. Well, it's too late. It's way too late. All the ripple effects of, like you just said, have happened already, and you can't go back. You know.
The other issue I see is that I feel like beekeepers have way too much faith in our miticides. That, you know, just because you apply a miticide does not mean that you fixed your problem, and that again underscores the importance of monitoring before you apply and after you apply to gauge your progress.
I always tell my hobbyist beekeepers that the commercial beekeepers are hard to talk to, but they're the ones I worry about the most. But let's go back to the hobbyist. So you sample 6 times a year. I sort of sample 2 or 3, with one of my key sampling points being down here in mid-February is nice, because what I like about that period of time is if I need to do an intervention, I have the possibility of using a miticide, but I also have the possibility of using drone trapping, because our drone production skyrockets in March. So if beekeepers want to try a drone trapping technique, and of course they've got to do it properly, they do have time to implement that and or use a miticide in February into March to get things under control before our major honey flows, which begin in mid-April, well, April into May. So I like to have a sampling then, and then I always tell them, whatever you do, whether it's drone trapping or use of a miticide, you've got to check again to make sure it worked. I mean, you sample to know you needed to treat. You do your treatment, and then whatever that regime is, you need to look afterward to make sure, because you still have time to save your bees if it didn't work. Go to some other miticide or some other technique, and you know, before you get into a honey flow. And so many of them don't. Now, here's the problem with here. I'm going to give you a story about commercial beekeepers, and I'm not picking on them. It's just the way they are. They're more regimented in their use of their chemicals, and many of them use the same chemical or have used the same chemical for 10 to 15 years without changing, which is a horrible farming practice because it breeds for resistant pests.
It's a perfect breeding program.
So one issue, I've always felt like we must have mites that are resistant to amitraz, because so many commercial beekeepers are using amitraz year after year after year for decades. And I keep harping on that. Then some researchers went out and said, we can't find amitraz resistant Varroa. But here's the story, the punchline to one of the stories I know. A lot of these commercial guys buy amitraz illegally and formulate their little blue shop towel. And one theory is, at least in a couple cases, is that these guys, when they bought their 55-gallon drum of illegal amitraz, it had no insecticide in it. It was just solvent. And and when because they had failures, mite failures, colonies were dying left and right from mites. And I'd say, amitraz resistance. Well, no, they bought stuff they bought from a source that wasn't legal, and it didn't have an insecticide in it, at least in a couple of cases I know about. So that's the risk. If you don't know what you're actually using, and if you do know what you're using, if you use it repeatedly, that's a big mistake. So if you are going to use chemicals, please rotate every year or so, use something different to avoid that issue.
Yeah, I would say number 1, stay on label. Number 2, rotate.
Definitely.
I mean, these off-label miticides in colonies, I think, has a real risk of giving beekeeping a black eye. If we have some contamination products in our products of the hive related to off-label use of miticides, that's going to be a problem for the whole industry. And I do think that we are seeing some resistance, some mite resistance to amitraz. It's not widespread, but I think it's there. I think it's related to that.
There certainly are research groups that are seriously looking for it now. Here's what I'll say to it. I've had some conversations with EPA about bees and beekeeping, and they're doing their best to try and mitigate issues with pollinators. And they get so frustrated when they hear about the hypocrisy of beekeepers willing to use off-label insecticides within the hive. Here they are, EPA is trying to find the right balance of controlling how other people, farmers and growers, use insecticides to protect pollinators. And the beekeepers, yeah, we want that. We need that to protect our bees. And then the EPA officials feel like, and then they turn around and they do what they complain about that others are doing. And it's frustrating, and frankly, they don't understand the hypocrisy. EPA doesn't. And I kind of agree with them, but talking to beekeepers sometimes is, I feel like I'm the Charlie Brown teacher in the front of the class going, wah, 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 and that's what they hear. But I mean, I understand it. They feel like they can buy this illegal amatraz for pennies on whatever the volume and save some money, but it's illegal and it's dangerous, and it's just not what we need to be.
I think they're shooting themselves in the foot, quite frankly.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there are a lot of issues around that, and I think that we're going to be hearing more about those issues in the next couple of years.
Yeah,
and I would love for beekeepers to get ahead of that and deal with it on their own before the regulators have to.
Yeah, and there's no reason for our small scale beekeepers to even go down those paths.
Right.
If you're going to use chemicals, like you said, use them legally. And I think a lot of small scale beekeepers, even those that want to use chemicals or use chemicals, they want to minimize their use of chemicals. They want to do it right, because you got always have this balance. I'm trying to protect my bees against this pest, but we also have the issues of using chemicals, and there's this tension that's always there. We want what's best for our bees, or at least a good balance. And so I just think small scale beekeepers, that's why I like small scale beekeepers. I feel like I can talk to them and convince them to move in those directions and have a healthier approach to managing Varroa. The commercial guys are a different audience altogether, but they too need to be moved.
Yeah, but that monitoring program can really help you walk that balance between not using pesticides. Don't use them when you don't need to. If your monitoring indicates that you're okay at the moment, wait till you need to use them. But the other thing I would say is assume that what you did was not effective. Have a plan B, do your monitoring, and find out if you need to implement plan B or if you're good at the moment, right?
No, you're absolutely right. You need a plan B. And those plan Bs vary with seasons. So, you've got to be aware of, okay, if I make a decision now and it didn't work, here's how my colony has progressed. Here are the issues I have now. And it's different than it was 2 months ago. So you have to be aware, of a lot of things when you have these alternate management schemes, but you do need them in place. And there may come a point, and I've had a lot of beekeepers realize this, that I may have to sacrifice a little bit of honey production to save this colony. Here it is, end of April, and I've got a problem. I can't wait till June. I'm going to lose these bees. And, a good management scheme, they would never get that high in April, but you know how that is.
There are those points where you have to decide what's more important to you: bee health or honey production, or whatever you're managing for. What do I want to pick? Which way am I going to go on this? So
exactly.
Again, monitoring helps you make those decisions. I just can't underscore that enough, how important that is.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think that's fundamental, and it's something. Every workshop I have for beginning beekeepers, we always have. Unfortunately, we have this little segment on just how to sample and make decisions for their bees. Now, I oftentimes with beginning beekeepers, I don't know if this is your philosophy, but so many of them, I would say, they're so tentative anyway when they're first learning bees. So I've actually evolved myself a little bit, and what I say now is, in your first year, just treat. To get through this episode, monitor and know to treat, but go ahead and just treat. Then figure out your management technique. What's your philosophy going to be, and evolve it and mature it to what you want it to be, whether it's using non-chemical or chemical. But so many of the issues we have down here is you can buy nukes that are already too high in mites when you install them. And if you don't do something, you can lose that unit. So I've actually changed my philosophy, because I used to say, it's bad to just treat without sampling, but on the first year, I'll make an exception. I want to get them into beekeeping. I don't want them too discouraged by losing their first unit, because when they bought it, it wasn't to no fault of their own. The mite population was higher than it should have been. And I've had that happen down here. And so, but I still try and encourage with follow-up workshops to try and sample and make decisions with whatever management scheme they're using. But
I've heard someone say, your job as a mentor is to help the beekeeper keep that colony alive long enough for the bees to teach them what they need to know. Like, so if you're losing your bees at the end of the season, you're not making much headway on your path.
nope.
It's really important to keep those things alive and make it through it. In fact, I hesitate to call you a beekeeper unless you've overwintered a colony or two. You got to earn those wings, right? If you've overwintered a couple colonies, then you can go out and get the bee tattoo and all that. But let's wait until you've overwintered a couple.
I'll have to agree with you on that. And so I want to tell you about a second-year beekeeper this reminded me of. He was having trouble with Varroa management in his first 2 years. And he came to me and I said, okay, I worked with him and he wasn't opposed to using chemicals. So we did try, I think we used Apivar to get his colonies in shape before main honey flow. But then I taught him the concept of using oxalic acid as a fumigation post broodless, without brood in the late fall into December. And as a cleanup, he calls it a cleanup treatment. And the first year we did it, I think we ended up doing it just after Thanksgiving. And he had 28 colonies. And we had done the management with Apivar early in the year before the honey flow. And then we managed to get a fall cleanup in and really knocked his mites back. Well, we didn't sample again. I said, just hold off sampling and let's just let it go. And which you would have sampled before we did. We sampled on April 28th the next year, all 28 colonies. Half of them were zeros, and the rest were less than 3 mites per 100. 3 mites for a total of 300 bees. So he was, it woke him up. He's like, this is awesome. So he now has a regime where he samples 3 or 4 times a year, but he always follows up with that cleanup, and he feels confident now that he's managing this and he's sampling to know. And as far as I know, he has no treatment issues or no mite problems since then. So so it's really nice.
That's some of what so I've been doing this 6 times a year monitoring for the last 2 years. My goal is to be able to monitor less, but I want to make sure that my plan is solid, and I'm going to let that, guide me. If I can lose a monitoring or 2, I would like to do that, but right now I'm not comfortable doing that. But
no, I think that's good. I think so. I've read some of Randy's Oliver stuff in American, and I think, gosh, sometimes he samples 18 times a year, some crazy number. And that seems a little high.
But so the other thing is, I would say is it's important for me to sample every colony in my apiary because I'm always finding outliers. So maybe most of the apiary is good, but there's 10% that are out of control. And it's really important that I catch the 10% because they're going to impact everybody else if I don't deal with them. So,
yeah, there was this concept Marla Spivak had a student develop of sort of apiary sampling to make apiary level sampling treatment decisions. And it may be as good for a guy with 10,000 colonies who he's hedging, he's going to lose some anyway, but I don't know. And it's one of these things, if you have, I think it was more than 60 colonies in an apiary, you only sample 20 of them. I forgot the exact number. But I'm kind of like you. I feel much more comfortable sampling everything and making a treatment decision on the colony than I do on the apiary because I just feel like I have lower losses if I do it that way.
So at this time of year, everybody in the apiary gets treated no matter what. But earlier in the season, I'm only treating those that are above my threshold. But the other thing is I talked to Katie Lee, was the person that did that work with Marla.
Yes. Yeah, that's right.
I spoke with her late last year about that and about her recent PhD dissertation. And so my comment to her was like, I know you did this work and it's probably sufficient. It's probably a good advice 10 years ago. But now with the way that the viruses are more detrimental than they were back then, can we still get away with doing this, doing some subsampling? And she didn't seem to think it was much of a good idea anymore, and I would agree that the more sampling the better.
Yeah, no, I thought her idea was good because when I was thinking about large commercial beekeepers, because I thought it would save them time and energy in sampling, but it turns out they're not sampling anyway. Right. So we're really talking to the smaller beekeepers, and I think they're going to end up saving more by looking at every colony.
Yeah.
And like you said, it saves the mite bomb experience if you miss an outlier, and you don't jeopardize the good colonies you have with letting the dog through, the bad one through.
Yeah, yeah. For example, not this year, but last year, when my first sampling was in February, I did not have a good, I did not do a oxalic cleanup, the year before. And I had a colony in my apiary in February that was at 5%. And
Oh,
if
wow.
I had not done any monitoring
Oh, yeah.
until August, that would have really been a disaster, not just for that colony, but for others in my apiary and other apiaries in my neighborhood. So it's important to catch it early.
No doubt. You're already, that's really high.
Yeah.
I'm ANSI above 1% in February. It's,
Anyway.
But that's the beauty of sampling. And so I think if nothing else, if our audience can just understand that sampling should be part of the hobby, and it should help you shape or understand that what you're doing to control this pest is working or not, that's what's important. And if it's not, to have the backup plans, because otherwise you're going to lose your bees. It's that simple.
So I think it's easier to have the conversation with the backyard beekeepers, but I think the commercial beekeepers need to hear this message, whether they want to.
They do
it or not. They need to hear
it. Every chance I get, I'm yelling at them. We have good conversations. I still get frustrated. I know earlier this year, I think it was February, March, I went down to inspect some bees to go to California, and I was so frustrated. Every single hive, I sampled 10% of a few thousand colonies, and every single hive had a blue shop towel. It was so frustrating because this particular beekeeper I had conversations with before about trying to rotate chemicals, trying to be legal, and there they are, the blue shop towels. And it's like, come on, we got to advance beyond this. And yelling's not a good thing. And you just end up with a sore throat, and they're not going to listen anyway. But I try and reason with them and let them understand that this is not a good long-term solution to this mite problem, and it's probably going to cause you more trouble than it's worth. And try and reason on that level. It's going to cost you more money in the long run if you get resistant mites, because you can't control them anymore, and you're going to lose more and more bees. And you try and go at that level and just kind of chip away. That's all you can do with some people. But you have to have that conversation. And that's the job of someone like me, is not to give up. It's to keep pressing what I think is the right approach. And whether my client wants to hear it or not, just kind of have to.
I think we have to talk about pesticide stewardship, the same way we talk about pesticide stewardship with apple growers or whoever. If you overuse this material, we're going to lose it. And I think we have the same obligation as beekeepers to protect.
This is not a new problem to agriculture, and we ought to learn from the history in front of us. This happens with every farming group, and beekeepers just haven't had to, until the Varroa episode, didn't really have to use chemicals to manage a pest before inside the hive. So from a beekeeper's point of view, this is new, but this issue is not new to farming. I mean, and so you're right. We have to teach them the same principles. And our arsenal is small, and you need to preserve it if you want to take full advantage.
And if we want our arsenal to grow it all, we need to show industry that we're willing to pay them for their efforts. Beekeepers are so eager to subvert the pesticide market that there's no incentive for industry to support.
Not going to get their money back. And what I tell people is, people don't realize when a chemical company makes a new insecticide for pest control in agriculture, for example, or even a new flea collar, they're investing $300 to $500 million to make a new pesticide, especially if it's a brand new chemical. Now, sometimes it's a lot less if they're just reformulating an existing active ingredient. But if it's a brand new chemical, there's roughly a $300 to $500 million investment over about a 10 to 15 year period to get that chemical to the market. And they need to get that money back. Otherwise, why would a company do it? And so if you're going to make blue shop towels, I'm not going to make you new chemistry. You're right, absolutely right. Because I can't get my money back. I can't make a profit.
I guess back in the day, the original amatraz active ingredient people kind of just took their ball and went home. Said, "Oh, if you're gonna sue us, we'll quit, right?
Yep.
And that's what they
Yeah.
did, and we lost that product, that
Yep.
legal product. Got it back maybe 5 years ago, but
A similar compound, finproximate, was I think it was called hive stand. Similar issue. Well, we're just not going to play the game. And fortunately, I do think, I mean, I'm torn between the organic acids, but certainly they have their role. And I do think oxalic acid has been a good thing. It took me a while to warm up to it, but after seeing it, the way it can be used safely with bees, I do like its use. But you're right, just in general, like you said, we need to be good stewards of this arsenal for ourselves and for future beekeepers. We really do. And sampling is critical to that.
right. So. Well, Jeff, we could have this conversation all day, man. I really
Sure.
appreciate you stopping by. I meant for this to be like a 20-minute conversation, but I think it turned into maybe an hour. And I could
Oh,
keep you
well,
all
that's
day.
all right. Hope it can be used. Hope people will listen to it.
Yeah. So hopefully I'm gonna just throw this up on YouTube and people can get to it there. But man,
All
I sure do appreciate you stopping by. I really enjoyed the conversation. I think we're on the same wavelength, and I really appreciate talking to you, and I appreciate all the work that you've done for beekeepers, beekeeping through the years, and continue to do. So stay cool down there. Don't overheat. Drink lots of water, and
Yes, sir.
keep
Well,
doing
thank
the
you
good
very much
stuff.
for having me, and I've enjoyed it.
Good. Thank you, Jeff. Take care.
Take care. You too.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye. All right.